Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I am your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. Today, we will be recapping some of the Week 8 NFL action with an eye towards Week 9. Without further ado, Ryan, kick us off with our upcoming Thursday night football matchup.
Yeah, we got the Steelers versus the Titans. Steelers are 3-point favorites. Game total is 36.5, which is very, very low. Steelers defense continues to be a strong group, but Minkah Fitzpatrick has an injury situation, could be out on a short week. Offense continues to be volatile, underwhelming even. With Pickett, you're looking at a guy, the best case scenario for him long-term here is, 16th to 24th best quarterback in the league. It's not exactly something you're looking for, but on the other hand, he's going to be better than certain guys. Like, for instance, I'd rather have Kenny Pickett than Desmond Ridder, but, we might not even get Kenny Pickett this week. It might be the Mitchell Trubisky show again. You can beat Tennessee through the air, which, again, for this purposes, I'd rather have Pickett than Trubisky. But what's important here for fantasy, Josh, is what do you think about this wide receiver room in Pittsburgh?
So Deontay Johnson returned from the hamstring injury last week. We now have 2 weeks of data. Last week, week 7, Pickens led the team. He had a 35% target share. His average depth of target was 16 yards downfield. That's an unbelievable role. But Deontay Johnson had the 26% target share at a pretty healthy 10 yards downfield on average. Then week 8, it kind of flips. Deontay Johnson gets the massive target share at a respectable average depth of target, and Pickens falls to 13%. Ultimately, both weeks, Deontay's been there. His target share was at least 26%. With Pickens, we had a good game and a bad game, and I think that's kind of what we should be expecting rest of season, is that Deontay's the more consistent target earner. Pickens is the guy capable of the bigger spike weeks, but overall is going to be much more inconsistent. I'll have Deontay Johnson higher ranked for week 9. The Titans can be beat out wide from the slots. They're essentially one of the most fantasy-friendly matchups across the board for receivers, so I'll just defer to the guy that seems to have the more consistent role.
Yeah, for Pittsburgh offense on that front, the biggest issue there is Titans have a premium defensive front. Their offensive line still not exactly what we expect from the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, on the Titans side of things, Josh, their stars carried the game last week against the Falcons. The big dog had over 100 yards on the ground. DeAndre Hopkins blew up for 128 for 3 touchdowns. But the most important thing, both in the present and the future for the Tennessee Titans, Josh, what do you think about Will Levis?
So I made a big thread on Twitter about him, since when I was digging into the stats, it was weird. His 4 passing touchdowns tied with Marcus Mariota for most by a quarterback in their first NFL start since 1970. Boom, we like that. His average throw depth was nearly 12 yards downfield. That was second best on the day. 8.2 yards per pass attempt was 9th on the day. This is all very, very, very exciting. And then when you look and you go, Titans have the worst offensive line in football. Yet Will Levis had the 13th highest average time to throw, so he's holding the ball quite a while. And his success rate was abysmal. He was only successful in about a third of his pass attempts. If you actually watch the game, you'll see that most Will Levis pass attempts were not super accurate, generally only a few yards downfield. It was really a few big plays that broke things open. So I'll break down those 4 touchdowns. The 61-yard touchdown to DeAndre Hopkins was mostly Hopkins. He had a double move. He had over 5 yards of separation. Levis did a good job, obviously, making the throw, but it's a throw that if he didn't make, we'd criticize him. The 47-yarder to DeAndre Hopkins for another touchdown, potentially offensive pass interference. You see the defender just give up on the play completely. Hopkins catches the ball with nobody within 10 yards of him. Ryan, I actually want to ping-pong it back to you for a second. I think the throw was kind of dangerous. He's throwing it when Hopkins is basically tied up, and it's almost like, did Hopkins need to have the borderline offensive pass interference to make up for a throw that was really not anywhere near him? It was towards the middle of the field. To me, at least, it looked like a potential interception.
I remember that play specifically, actually, for 2 reasons. One, to answer your question, I think with a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, he's earned the right to give him 50-50 balls. That one doesn't bother me too much. On the other hand, I don't remember which Falcons cornerback it was, but while the play was still in progress, he was yelling at the referees. And just like as a coach, like that dude would never see the field again if I was his coach. It's like, listen, man, you're dealing with DeAndre Hopkins. Why are you letting him run into the end zone while you're talking to referees? So, but yes, with a guy like Hopkins, give him 50-50 balls. That's what he's there for.
And then the 16-yard touchdown to Hopkins, it was a quick slant, and it was thrown behind him. Hopkins made a nice little adjustment and broke a tackle to score. The really, really good play for me, and I assume you would agree, his best throw of the day was the touchdown to Nick Westbrook-Ikine. 33 yards kind of off his back foot with two guys in his face pressuring him. Ultimately, we mostly saw some pretty mediocre pass attempts with a few ridiculous highlights mixed in. The arm strength, we already knew that was great. We knew the accuracy would be an issue. And I'd say through 1 week, it's obviously a good debut, but I wouldn't say that he erased concerns at all. But I also would say that like we did see the arm talent. So I'm very curious to see what the Steelers do. I do not think I'll have nearly as much time to throw in that matchup.
Yeah, agree with you across the board there. And that's Jay Larky Tweets. Diving into the film this week. I love it. I love it, Josh. Nick Botiford's waiver wire column is already up on the site right now. He talks about Will Levis, and we'll jump back into Will Levis tomorrow on our waiver wire show that will be released right around noon Eastern. We'll tell you what we're doing with him in season-long fantasy. Now, next up, Josh, big game. Unfortunately, it's in Europe, so that's kind of a downer here, but Chiefs versus Dolphins, battle of two AFC heavyweights. Tyreek Hill's return against his former team. Spreads Chiefs -2.5. Totals 51 points. Now, for the Chiefs, Josh, who just lost to Denver, defense was good. They generated pressure all day. Familiarity is why I'm throwing this game out. They played Denver 2 weeks ago. Denver played a good defensive game against them. Doesn't really concern me too much. That said, Sky Moore dropped a 4th and 2 bomb. I think it was 40 yards in the end zone. I'd imagine that puts him in the doghouse for the considerable future. It was a terrible, terrible drop, if we're being honest, where Kansas City might have ended up squeaking this one out. If he catches that, changes the whole game. What are you thinking with Kansas City in general, Josh?
I'm going to throw out this week 8 game. I live in Denver. It was very, very cold. Patrick Mahomes apparently contracted the flu. I did not really enjoy being outside at all this weekend, and I am perfectly healthy without the flu. I'm going to throw this one out. With Rashee Rice, I think what we saw was really positive. The target share was actually not great, but he only ran one fewer route than Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Second week in a row, he ran more routes than Sky Moore. As you mentioned, Moore is almost certainly in the doghouse. The way we should think about Rashee Rice, because we haven't really had like the massive fantasy point game yet, he is a starting receiver with Patrick Mahomes with good peripherals. I think he's an excellent trade target still. Think of him as a buy high where everyone likes Rashee Rice, but I'm buying high where I think the value can potentially get quite a bit higher.
Now, on the other side of things, Miami. Jalen Ramsey made his presence as a Dolphin felt early in that game. He picked off a pass to kind of turn the game for good. Early game plan on defense from New England was to basically stop the short crossers that Mike McDaniel's been killing everyone with. No one can handle Tyreek Hill in space. But then they adjusted pretty early on and hit New England over the top with Tyreek Hill. Jalen Waddle had his best game of the season to date. You know, Tyreek Hill continues to be a spectacle, and they have that two-way threat where even if you can shut down Tyreek Hill, which New England didn't, you still have Jalen Waddle. So, again, Josh, this is one of the most innovative offenses in football. 2 speed demons. What are you thinking about them in this game and going forward?
Yeah, one thing that I think we should be aware of for fantasy, the running back room just keeps getting messier. Back-to-back weeks that Mostert's led the team in carries, but in these past 2 weeks, he's only averaging 11 carries a game. He has almost no pass game role, so pretty much just a touchdown-dependent option. Salvon Ahmed's been the one that's run more routes the past 2 weeks, and then we've had Jeff Wilson, who's been getting more carries than Ahmed, and also had a little bit of a pass game role, kind of like Mostert. The way that I'm seeing it is that Salvon Ahmed can remain on waivers in most leagues outside of the absolute deepest. Jeff Wilson, he's probably a buy or a hold. I would be selling Raheem Mostert. And ultimately, I think this just continues to clear the runway for Devon Achane, who I believe returns in week 10, if not week 11. He's currently on injured reserve. He was the guy that was getting all the carries and all the routes after his first blow-up game. And so he basically had the blow-up game where he was way more efficient than Mostert. The next week, they said, hey, you're going to get significantly better usage than Mostert in the run game and in the pass game. And then the week after that, he got injured after putting up another huge fantasy day. So I think this is all pointing towards he's been the only guy to have multiple weeks where it looks like he's the guy in this backfield.
On the 33rdteam.com on Tuesdays, Josh, Kev Wheeler, Matthew Hill release their fantasy rankings every Tuesday afternoon. I rank the top 12 defenses in that release. Then on Wednesday, Josh breaks out his rest of season rankings and his trade calculator. Look for both of those again on the 33rdteam.com. Next up, Josh, Packers versus Rams. Packers are -3 home favorites right now. They were -1.5, but it looks like Matthew Stafford might miss this contest. This line probably goes even more haywire if that becomes official. Game total is 40 points. For me, Josh, the Packers continue to look like one of the worst offenses in the league. We said it before the season. Life without Aaron Rodgers is not going to be a pleasant thing. It's actually a little worse than I was expecting. Do you have any positives to take away from this offense?
I'll get to the positives, but I think we should mention a few negatives first. Jordan Love had over 9 yards per pass attempt in week 1. That's very, very exciting. Since that game, he's averaged 6 yards per pass attempt. 9 yards per attempt is Tua Tagovailoa level. 6 yards per attempt is what Zach Wilson has on the season. And then the past 2 weeks, hello, A.J. Dillon. He's run more routes than Aaron Jones in both games. He also outrushed Aaron Jones 15-8 with carries 2 weeks ago. And then last week, Jones outcarried him, but it was 7-6. It was basically even. However, over the past 2 games, both of the red zone or both of the goal line carries went to A.J. Dillon. And then 4 of the 5 red zone carries went to Dillon as well. Aaron Jones is basically getting none of those green zone carries, and he has fewer routes run than Dillon. I still think we should prefer Aaron Jones rest of season. He'll obviously take a hit in my rankings. I'm hoping it's just the hamstring bothering him more. But if you were to only look at the past 2 games, you would be projecting A.J. Dillon to score more fantasy points rest of season. One positive note, because I said there was a little positivity. 3 receiver sets was the default for Green Bay against the Vikings this past week. That was good for rookie Jaden Reed. He led the team with over 80 yards, but he was out-targeted by Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson. I wouldn't be too optimistic about him, but I think that is a positive that at least for his sake, he was on the field running about 40 routes, just like Watson and Doubs.
Let's see Larky tweets for the Rams. Josh, we're looking at Brett Rypien or Stetson Bennett if Matthew Stafford can't play. I don't know what Stetson Bennett's injury situation is, so it might be Rypien. I know for me, if the Rams were playing a team that I found reliable at all in this game, I'd be betting at least 3 units on the opponent this week. I don't have a ton of faith in Green Bay, which disheartens me a little bit, Josh, especially because this could end up being a full 7 points if Brett Rypien's the starter in this game. That said, Josh, for fantasy purposes, the Rams' backfield still is not quite solved. Do you have any insights on that group?
I still think Darrell Henderson's the 1A, Royce Freeman's the 1B. Both of these games, Henderson led in carries. Both games, Henderson was much more productive in the pass game. Royce Freeman did get the lone goal line carry this past week. He ran a few more routes, but Freeman wasn't targeted on his routes. Darrell Henderson caught all 3 of his targets for 54 yards. You have to think he's going to be the pass down back when it comes to actually getting targeted and getting fantasy points through the air. If Stafford plays, I think Henderson's a low-end fantasy RB2. Royce Freeman, maybe he's a flex. If Stafford is out and it's Brett Rypien, however you want to say his name, Darrell Henderson, maybe fantasy RB3-ish. You can talk yourself into it. And I simply would not be playing Royce Freeman at all.
Same. I'm going to be, if it's, be it Rypien or Stetson, I'm going to be avoiding as many Rams as possible, maybe with the exception of Cooper Kupp. Next up, Falcons versus Vikings. This game's been flipped on its head because of the Kirk Cousins injury situation. It opened at Falcons -3.5. It's already up to Falcons -4.5. Game total's 37.5 points. Desmond Ridder was 8 for 12 yesterday when he got a concussion, but was cleared and didn't come back. So I guess it wasn't technically a concussion, Josh, just a concussion scare. But he took 5 sacks and he lost a fumble during that time period. Taylor Heineke came in, played reasonably well. Here's the thing, Josh, and we talk about this every week, and it's becoming tiresome, at least for me. I'm sure you agree here. Arthur Smith continues to do weird things. If you were going to go into this season with this roster, with Desmond Ridder, why are you pulling him when you're 4-3? Why are you throwing in the towel at this point? Where do you go from here? And here's the other thing, Josh. Deception's a big part of football, especially on offense. I enjoy play action for that purpose. I don't think you need to be a genius to deploy play action. So I've never really liked Arthur Smith as much as most people. I thought he was kind of a bizarre hire, kind of like Matt Eberflus was. So let me ask, to frame it this way. You're going to hire the Colts defensive coordinator? Why? You're going to hire the Titans offensive coordinator? Why? And now things are starting to completely get out of control here. The Kyle Pitts, Drake London, whatever madness is going on with Bijan Robinson. And now suddenly this guy's realizing they shouldn't have went into the year with Desmond Ridder as their quarterback. Maybe you should have at least tried to talk to Lamar Jackson. Josh, what is going on in Atlanta?
Yeah, just to back up what you said. So Desmond Ridder dropped back 18 times and took 5 sacks. That is getting sacked more, about 30% of his dropbacks essentially in this game. That's god awful. He averaged under 6 yards per pass attempt, even when he wasn't getting sacked and getting the ball out. Heineke, on the other end, took 1 sack on his 24 dropbacks. That's a rate of about 4%, much better than what was that, the 20, 25, 27, 30%. Also, even when Heineke was passing, he was more efficient, more than 8 yards per pass attempt. Obviously, it's a tiny 1-game sample. I'm not saying that Heineke should be the starter or that he is the future, because I think his ceiling's pretty low as well. But it's kind of what we talked about, where it's just total incompetence from, it's almost like the front office and then the head coach and Arthur Smith. There's incompetence across the board. How do you see what the rest of this division looks like? See what your skill players look like, see what the offensive line looks like, and then go into the year with a quarterback room of Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke. With Bijan, the headache is gone. That's good. The fantasy points weren't really there, but he outsnapped Tyler Algier 48-15. He outcarried him 11-8. The Bijan didn't actually catch any passes in this one, but he had 30 routes run. Nobody else in the running back room had more than 9, and he did get 5 targets. So Bijan, pretty bad fantasy day, but ultimately led the team in carries, is pretty much the only pass game weapon of note with a huge pass game role. Still looks like a fantasy RB1 rest of season. And this will be the second week in a row that I recommend, based on public sentiment, we should be buying him in fantasy football.
Let me ask you a question, Josh. Since the trade deadline's tomorrow, Ryan Tannehill makes sense in Atlanta, right? Given that they just pulled Desmond Ridder and, like you said, Taylor Heineke, we kind of already know who he is. The ceiling's not really high. Does that move make sense?
Yeah, I think it would be foolish for the Titans to see Will Levis's first game and say, no, you can't see the field 2 weeks from now. And just like with the Falcons, Tannehill has had stretches where he looks like one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the NFL. Ridder, Heineke have never had a stretch like that. I think you gamble on the veteran. When I'll also note that Tannehill, when he was with, or when Arthur Smith was with the Titans, worked with Tannehill. So there's familiarity there. It wouldn't just be airdropping a quarterback mid-season randomly. It would be very purposeful. So I like that.
Yeah, agreed across the board there. And if we're being honest, the reason Arthur Smith has a head coaching job is because of the work he did with Tannehill in Tennessee. So I hope that happens for Falcons fans' sakes. With the Vikings, Josh, Kirk Cousins was probably having his best year of his career to this point. He's been great. You know, he beat the 49ers 2 weeks ago. He's out for the rest of the year, most likely. I don't know if it's official yet with an Achilles injury. So that's a tragedy that derails this team, especially because the defense was starting to trend up. Brian Flores has really been starting to put his footprint on this unit, where they've been a good defense for a month now. Now we have 5th-round rookie Jaron Hill at quarterback. And, you know, we've talked about this. With backup quarterbacks, number 1 wide receivers tend to get, you know, tunnel vision, a lot of targets. Is TJ Hawkinson with Justin Jefferson out? Is TJ Hawkinson technically the wide receiver 1 on this team?
I think that's probably what's going to happen. He has the lower depth of target. I think he's going to be the easy layup type pass option. Speaking of Jaron Hall, for anyone that wants to know more about him, 5-year player at BYU. That is where Zach Wilson happened to go to college. He's got a little mobility. He was taken in the 5th round of the draft this year. Ultimately, this is not the archetype of quarterback that has NFL success. For me, I would be selling Vikings players. Everyone out there would be like, whoa. Everyone's selling Vikings players. You can't sell low. The way I see it is that it's probably going to get lower, because right now we have yet to see a Jaron Hall start. I think when you see a start like this, players' values are going to drop even more. Jordan Addison has 7 touchdowns. 1 in 5 receptions for him has been a touchdown. That is certainly not going to keep up. And then in the running back room, you can't start anybody. 3 of the past 4 weeks were a true running back committee with Alexander Mattison and Cam Akers splitting time. I think it is just absolute doomsday for both fantasy, real football. I would hope the Vikings start selling off some of these pieces.
Larky tweets, you know, I'm going to look to trade some Vikings because, like, again, I'm not really a sell low kind of guy, but that makes sense. It's especially with Jordan Addison, it's probably going to get worse from here. You know, there's 4 teams on buys this week. Let's rip through them real quick and get to see the Lions on Monday night against the Raiders. Jaguars have won 5 straight. We all know Trevor Lawrence can headline a quality offense. He's one of the best college quarterback prospects in history. But what's exciting here for Jaguars fans is the defense has played very well during this stretch. That continues. The Jaguars can compete in the AFC. And, you know, you, myself, Daniel Raz, we bet on the Jaguars to end up with the number 1 seed at 12-1 type odds in the offseason. So I know we're all secretly rooting for that. Denver, the defense has played well 3 weeks in a row. The offense still is not quite there, but at least, again, one of the most bizarre things in recent years is how bad the Broncos defense was in the first month, where this makes more sense to me now. Then there's San Francisco. Since Brock Purdy took that jarring hit at the end of the Vikings game, he hasn't quite played as well. Mobility's still fine. He still makes a number of good throws, but he's made a few questionable decisions. Maybe things are catching up to him. Maybe it's the injuries. The bye is coming at a good time for San Francisco. Now back in a Week 9 action, Josh, another good game. Last week we only had one game, Bengals 49ers. This week we have a few. Ravens versus Seahawks. Ravens are 5.5-point home favorites. Game total is 43 points. I'm going to focus on Lamar Jackson here, Josh. Guy's awesome. I said it last week. Years ago, I think it was 2019 when he won his MVP. I made a pretty good chunk of change with some MVP tickets in my pocket there. He's one of the few guys in the league that can carry an offense. That said, Baltimore scored 31 points this week. Lamar Jackson had 157 passing yards. Last week against the Lions, he had over 300, and I think people double, maybe even triple count it when Lamar Jackson has a big productive game as a passer. He's not in the Patrick Mahomes area, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow. He's not as good of a passer as those guys. Yes, he can carry a team to the promised land like those guys do, but let's call him what he is. Dynamic athlete. That's a very good passer for how good of a runner he is. But to call him like a Joe Burrow level passer just rubs me the wrong way, Josh. Now, for the Ravens in general, you have any other thoughts on their offense?
Yeah, before giving those thoughts, guys, follow Ryan at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter/X. His power rankings are hitting the site tomorrow, Tuesday. His expert picks and predictions for every NFL game will hit the33rdteam.com on Thursday. Those are both free to read articles. He's watched every snap of every game since 2014. He lives to tell about it. And again, no one talks about football the way Ryan does. With the Ravens, I'll just give a quick note on Gus Edwards. If we look at week 2 onward, which is post J.K. Dobbins Achilles, Edwards is averaging 14 rush attempts a game. Justice Hill has been second with 6. And he's run 12 routes a game. Justice Hill has only run 14. Kind of workhorse usage. I've mentioned it for a few weeks that Gus Edwards sort of looks like a fantasy RB2. The fantasy points hadn't really been there most of these weeks, but we've had back-to-back weeks now with quite a few fantasy points coming on the ground. And I think that's kind of what we should expect, is that there's going to be some duds, but the ceiling can be pretty good when you're a workhorse back playing alongside Lamar Jackson and you weigh 240 pounds like Gus Edwards does.
Next up, Josh, the Seahawks. The Seahawks, they're a really good team, really good roster. The defense has been very good for a month now. Real good skill players, complete wide receiver trio, good backfield. But here's the thing, Josh. Geno Smith, I don't know if framing him as a Jekyll and Hyde quarterback's the right way, because he's made some spectacular throws. He's had 2 pretty good years, but he makes some, if the Seahawks don't go anywhere this year, I think it's primarily going to be on Geno. He had 2 picks and a fumble last week. The thing that you guys might not know is he also had another one, pick 6 on the sideline that was dropped, an egregious throw. I see this kind of stuff every week. I see some eye-catching throws too, but I want more consistency out of Geno Smith, especially since, again, Josh, we put some bets on the Seahawks this offseason, since they're actually technically in lead of the division right now too. So I'm curious, what do you got on the Seahawks offense?
So I know Kenneth Walker was supposedly dealing with a calf injury in this game. That could have been a factor, but still, I think we'd have to say that ultimately it was a great day for Zach Charbonnet. He outsnapped Kenneth Walker 31-24. Walker only had 8 carries. Charbonnet had 5. Both were incredibly efficient on the ground. 8 for 66 from Walker, 5 for 53 from Charbonnet. You got to like that. They each had 1 red zone carry. And then in the pass game, Charbonnet ran 22 routes to Walker's 10. Charbonnet, I would not say that we can just immediately fire him up in future games in fantasy, but I'd say he remains one of the absolute best bench stash running backs at the very least. We'll actually be doing a deep dive into these rookie running backs more later this week. I believe it'll be on Thursday. That'll be part of our collaborative series with Player Profiler. It should be Ryan and I, along with Billy Muzio. 2 years ago, he was the most accurate ranker in Fantasy Pros competition. I know I'm going to want to hear what he says about running backs like Ryan. He's a big film guy as well. So I think it'll be really interesting to talk about what we've seen from Walker and Charbonnet, and if Charbonnet's value can continue to rise and if he can continue to get a little more usage. Speaking of the other rookie in this offense, Jackson Smith and Jigba, We had 2 encouraging weeks after the bye, week 6 and week 7, where I was like, oh, he's getting more targets and he's down the field, because those first 4 games, he never had a depth of target above 4 in any game. Last week was back to square one. He had 4 targets for an 11% target share. He totaled 0 air yards. Some people will look at this as a good game. And if someone out there thinks this was the breakout because he had 12 fantasy points, 3 catches, 36 yards, and a touchdown, then I would actually consider them a potential sell, since he still looks like the clear number 3 in this pass game behind Metcalf and Lockett. And even Jake Bobo is mixing in more than you want. It's almost like a 4-headed monster in the pass game with 2 competent running backs. I wouldn't be terrified of Smith and Jigba in Dynasty, but for redraft, Ryan, it feels like there are a lot of hurdles for him to get consistent usage.
Yeah, I know we all wanted him to peak late in the year, and like you just said, I think there's more obstacles than we were anticipating a couple months ago. Pats versus Commanders here. Pats are 3-point home favorites, up from 2-point home favorites yesterday. That's kind of curious to me. Game total's 40 points. Here's the thing, Josh. This is a very tough survivor week, and in years past, Bill Belichick makes young quarterbacks' lives miserable the first time he plays them. Almost always is a long-standing history of that. I think Deshaun Watson's really the only example I can think of where it went the other way. But, the truth is this is no longer Bill Belichick's New England Patriots that we've been used to. It's a very limited roster. Some of their best players on defense are hurt. So I don't have a ton of confidence in them in Survivor, even though we should at least keep them on the table until later in the week. Are there any bright spots here for New England, Josh?
No, let's talk about the Commanders.
Oh, the Commanders. The defense is way underachieved, but Sam Howell, man, I tell you, another surge against the Eagles. Guy threw for 397 yards. His third game with over 290 yards passing. For, to give you a parallel here, Lamar Jackson's only thrown for over 240 yards once. One of the reasons, efficiency is wonderful. It's great. It's fantastic. But you have to, volume's part of the equation here too. And I'm not saying Sam Howell's better than Lamar Jackson, to be clear. That said, Washington still remains a pretty interesting offense. I'd like to hear your thoughts about all of it, Josh.
Yeah, I thought this was statistically Howell's best game. He dropped back 55 times against the Eagles' pass rush, took 1 sack. Every single week, we just hound Howell for pacing to set the sacks taken NFL record. So we should shout him out and say that, hey, dropping back 55 times against the Eagles, getting sacked once, that's something that even Patrick Mahomes, if you gave me over under 1.5 sacks taken when they played, I think I'd take the over on Mahomes, just to give context to how impressive that was for Howell, completing 75% of his passes. I think Howell is kind of, for fantasy, a top-end streamer at this point, if we like the matchup. I know this was a matchup that we both had some interest in, where we were a little concerned about the pass rush, but ultimately the Eagles' pass defense just hasn't been what it was last season. In the running back room, Chris Rodriguez did not touch the ball. He had been really eating into the carries of Brian Robinson those past 2 games, and didn't get any touches. I still would sell Brian Robinson. This is just a thumper in an offense that is starting to funnel more and more and more through the pass game with a questionable offensive line. When we look at the receiving core, Jahan Dotson now has back-to-back games with a target share of at least 20%. There's a little momentum building. I would say if he can stay in this range, lower end fantasy wide receiver 3 type. I'm not ready to proclaim him that just yet, because again, it's 2 games. And I think we should generally be a little bit pessimistic about Dotson when McLaurin's been getting more targets as well, and when Logan Thomas continues to command nearly 20% of the targets each week. There are just so many guys in this offense to feed, to get usage. And McLaurin looks like the wide receiver 1. Logan Thomas plays tight end, so he's a top 10 option each week. Dotson, I would still think of him mostly on the odd man outside, despite the 2 good games, but I'm open to being wrong. I just think if someone out there is very excited, get him off of your fantasy bench.
That's Larky tweets. Texans versus Buccaneers. Texans are 2.5-point home favorites. Game total is 40 points. One of the things I like to try to provide our listeners, Josh, is I'm not afraid of going against the herd. I've talked about this before too with sports betting. I treat my money as if it's already gone. I'm calculated. I'm not reckless at all. I'm very disciplined, but I treat it as if it's gone already so that I can be completely emotionless about everything. I'm not afraid to go on an island with anything. And, when CJ Stroud was, the talk of the town, so to speak, I talked about him differently than most. Efficient, great. Texans should be very happy with what they have right now here. But The production was a little bit inflated, as I said, from a couple long deep shot scores when the Texans were ahead by 2 scores late in games. Didn't think that was sustainable, really. And, I want to touch on this, Josh. There was an ESPN study recently that had Nico Collins and Tank Dell in the top 5. You say this, you give me credit for this. I'm aware of, I'm not like an anti-analytics guy, but just because you have a model doesn't mean you should care. When you see something like this, Tyreek Hill's 13th, Tank Dell's 5th, Nico Collins is 3rd. Like, let's just fire this one into the sun. Especially when it comes, again, I'm a big usage fan. Shout out to my guy, Dwayne McFarland, big fan of his stuff always. Especially when it comes to talent evaluation in football, I take it with a grain of salt. That said, Josh, I'm gonna take a bit of an L here. Right now in fantasy, Dameon Pierce may as well be Damian Harris. It's not working out. Curious what else you have to say about the Texans here.
Yeah, I'll back that up completely. Week 6, we had the committee with Pierce and Singletary. And then we had the week 7 bye, and then we had week 8, the first game off the bye. And once again, snaps were the same, 24 for Pierce, 23 for Singletary. Carries were 12-10 in Pierce's favor. They each had 2 red zone carries. Dameon Pierce, to his credit, got both goal line carries. Singletary ran slightly more routes. Singletary had 2 targets. Pierce wasn't targeted. Basically a 50-50 committee. With an offensive line that has not supported the running game, you should not be starting either of them in fantasy football. I mean, the Panthers should have been a great matchup. They were allowing pretty much 5.5 yards a carry to running backs this year. And the fact that neither of these guys could get much going, I think that's an indictment on this situation for fantasy football.
For the Buccaneers, I don't have too much to say about this team. They're among my, like you said, Josh, I've survived watching every snap of every game since 2014, but there's a few teams that I have to really grind through. Buccaneers are one of them. I'm not a big Baker Mayfield guy. Dicey penalty made that game look closer than it did. They got a penalty on 4th and 10. Just, oh God, that's why they scored late. That said, this is the first time I've watched Rachaad White play. And like, oh, okay, maybe there is something here. So in particular, Josh, where are you at on Rachaad White?
This will surprise people because I've been very negative about Rachaad White in many ways. I was not fully convinced we should draft him in fantasy this year. And when my rest of season rankings come out on Wednesday, I would expect to be above consensus. I thought week 8 was awesome usage. Too many people out there look at running back carries. Running back carries truly don't matter for fantasy points unless you have elite speed and or an elite offensive line. That is one thing that my research has shown me time and time again. Rachaad White is the perfect case study of this. He outsnapped other running backs in this backfield 50-8 on Thursday night. 50-8. He only outcarried 9-3. And I think that's where people are going to get hung up. They're like, 9 carries for Rachaad White. I need my running back to hit double digits. But he ran 31 routes. No other running back on the team ran more than 5. He's basically the pass game back. Baker Mayfield's generally checked the ball down to running backs at a pretty considerable clip. He had 7 targets in this one, caught all 7 for 70 yards. Ultimately, even with 9 carries, which we hate that he only had 9 carries, guys, 18 fantasy points against the Bills in PPR formats. I think Rachaad White is probably going to end up around RB20 in my rest of season rankings, given that he has a stranglehold on this backfield and an awesome pass game role. And I think out there, if people are panicking because he had under 9 carries, I would certainly try to scoop him up because this looks like a fantasy RB2 rest of season.
Josh's rest of season rankings will be on the site Wednesday afternoon. Check out where he has Rachaad White. And I'm with you there, Josh. One thing I'll add on top of that is Tampa couldn't run the ball last year either, with whether it was Fournette or White. But this passing game role cannot be ignored. You don't have to, like you said, you don't have to have 20 carries a week to be a valuable fantasy player. Next up, Browns versus Cardinals. Browns are 7-point home favorites, 39 game total. Big, again, if you're in survivor pools, this is one of the decisions you have to make this year. You're going to bet on the Browns defense against Josh Dobbs, potentially his offense. We'll see about that later in the week. Browns defense, after a tough outing against the Colts, they bounced back against a talented Seahawks offense. Didn't do quite enough, but they made a number of plays, disruptive all game. This offense, though, Josh, we talked about this last week. Every year, there's at least 1 or 2 teams that have a really good defense, but their offense is so volatile that it holds them back from being a factor. Can you make any sense out of this group?
Yeah, we talked about it last week, how this is kind of the worst case scenario for fantasy
Yeah.
overall points is when you have the great defense, the great offensive line, and then just horrible inconsistency in the pass game. It just leads to oftentimes a lot of running back touches spread amongst a group and not a lot of passing success. And that's kind of what we have. At the running back position this past week, we had a true three-way committee. Snaps, we had 27 for Kareem Hunt. Congrats, Kareem Hunt. But then 24 for Pierre Strong. Oh, and then also we had 23 for Ford. So if you go 27, 24, 23 in the snaps department, I am not interested in any of these running backs in fantasy. You're just hoping one of them punches it in and scores each week. The one positive I'd say is that with PJ Walker, David Njoku looks like a fantasy viable option. I'm not going to say that this is definitely what's going to happen each week, but both games with PJ Walker and Njoku's target share has been at least 26%. He's averaged 14 fantasy points a game over his past 2 games. That is pretty much the only positive at this point that we can say for fantasy.
On the Cardinals side, Josh, after 3 down weeks, they gave the Ravens a tough game again. Josh Dobbs looks solid. Still a very limited offense. That said, Josh, my guy Trey McBride, the tight end over in Arizona. I thought so much of Trey McBride as a late round stab dart throw in best ball leagues. I gave the guy a little bit of an accent. Seems like it's starting to happen here, Josh. Am I crazy? What are we thinking here with McBride going forward?
I've got to say your player takes are better than the accents, but I appreciate the effort there. I think it seems like you got McBride right. First game without Zach Ertz, 39% target share, caught 10 of those 14 targets for 95 yards and a touchdown. His average depth of target was 7 yards downfield. That's actually well above average for a tight end. He runs a 4.6 40 like Travis Kelce. He might be the number 2 in this offense behind only Hollywood Brown. I am very, very optimistic about McBride. And again, my rest of season rankings come out on Wednesday. He is going to be a massive mover up. Ryan, I've got a question for you, top of my head, because it was one I was pondering earlier. Would you rather have Evan Engram or Trey McBride rest of season? Because I think I'd lean Engram still, but it's not obvious anymore.
Yeah, I think in tight end premium, I'd rather have McBride than most other, just because I think he's going to see more volume. But it's a great question. Other formats, I think I'd still lean Engram, especially because, like, say something happens to Calvin Ridley, Evan Ingram's, in a wonderful position for you in fantasy. But great question, Josh. Great question. And speaking of accents here, Josh, we're gonna dip in the pool again here. Saints versus the Chicago Bears. The Bears. Saints are 7-point home favorites, 41.5 game total. Saints defense has been good all year, and we've been talking about positive regression for this passing attack for weeks, Josh. Derek Carr had a shoulder injury, I think 5 weeks ago. First 2 weeks, pretty dicey, clearly limited them on the field. Been gradually getting better. They blew up a little bit last week. One thing I'll note here before I pass this off to you, Chris Olave had a long score, probably would have been a long score, at least would have been close. Long pass play, probably scores, bounce off his face. So keep that in the chamber when you're doing projections this week. What do you think about the Saints passing attack going forward?
Yeah, let's keep on Chris Olave for a second. He looks like the best buy low in fantasy at the receiver position. It's been Marquise Brown for me the last few weeks. I'm pivoting. I'm now saying Olave, championing him as my number 1. He has over 9.5 targets per game, 13th among receivers this year. And he has 131 air yards per game. Only A.J. Brown has more. He's the wide receiver 35 right now in fantasy points per game. My expected fantasy points model looks at the usage. It sees the targets, the air yards, the opportunities. He's not the wide receiver 35 there. Because again, wide receiver 35, that's barely startable. He's the wide receiver 12, folks. The wide receiver 12. It is not every day that you get this. I posted about him on Twitter, actually, and how I think he's a buy low with some of these stats. A lot of the comments were, it's been 8 weeks, he is what he is. And I think that's actually a pretty common sentiment. And that's exactly why he's such a good buy low, is that, no, I would say he's not, is what he is. He's one of the NFL's better receivers. And the fact that he's underproducing so greatly, that's almost certain to change. So find that person in your league who's certain it, quote unquote, is what it is, and pluck Chris Olave. I'm going to rain on the Rashid Shaheed party a little bit. He ran 16 routes. He had a 10% target share in this contest. He caught all 3 targets for 153 yards and a touchdown. I'll probably consider him a flex option week 9 against the Bears. That's more matchup specific, though. He ran fewer routes. 16 routes was fewer than Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, and Jawan Johnson. Guys, if he's running fewer routes than even Jawan Johnson, we should not be expecting 150 yards and a touchdown. We should be expecting just a matchup-specific flex. that is still what Rashid Shaheed is, despite the big fantasy game.
The Bears, I'm just gonna dive into Tyson Bagent here real quick. Good processor, good decision maker. Actually impressed me on those fronts. Manages pressure pretty well. Made some pretty good throws on third down in this game too. I don't think he's gonna be laying siege to opposing offenses anytime soon. But I think Chicago at least has like a solid backup quarterback on their hands here. That said, Josh, none of that's a positive for fantasy football. How is Bagent affecting other Bears players in fantasy football?
So Justin Fields was averaging 7.5 air yards per pass attempt. That's decent, 7.5. Bagent's been at 5 this year. If he were a qualified passer, which he isn't quite yet, he'd be the lowest in the NFL with that mark. There's some PPR value. If we want to be positive, there's a little PPR value in the low ADOT. He's completed 70% of his passes. Fields has only completed 62%. But we've talked before, bad quarterbacks generally hyper-target the top option in a game. What's hard right now is that we've actually seen 2 players that he liked in 2 different games. And I would say there was very little leading us to know who it was going to be. Week 7, DJ Moore gets the 31% target share. Next best in the past game was Darnell Mooney, just 17%. Then this past week, week 8, Cole Kmet gets the 27% target share. DJ Moore was second with just 16%. If you're going to tell me that I don't know who's going to be the top option and that they're catching passes from Bagent, I'm just going to have to be a little naturally conservative with all of them. So, just great that he's completing passes. Great, like you said, that he's actually shown a little moxie under pressure. But for fantasy, it's really just not what we want for these pass catchers right now.
Panthers versus Colts, Josh. Panthers are 3-point home underdogs. Game totals 44 points. The Panthers, I picked them to win their first game in expert picks last week. I released those Thursday morning. I finalized my betting stances on Saturday morning in my betting previews. If you're interested in this kind of thing, how I'd recommend using these is Thursday, get your preview for the week. You can get through every game of the week. I'll give you insights on everything, give you a score prediction. Going to take you less than 10 minutes. Then come back on Saturday. Especially if you're a winter pool player, I've already won 3 weeks in winter pools. It's one of my favorite things to do. I'm profitable in every year. I look at that differently than most people. Josh, I don't have a lot of takeaways here from the Panthers offense. This was mostly a defensive win on their part, but I want to know what you're thinking with the Panthers backfield here.
Yeah, week 8, this was the first week of the new committee, as we'd been told. And it wasn't a new committee. It was just the Chuba Hubbard show. Chuba had 15 carries. Raheem Blackshear was actually second on the team with 3. And then Miles Sanders had 2. Chuba also led the team with 16 routes run. Miles Sanders had 9. I wouldn't cut Miles Sanders just yet. Usage might rotate in week 9. I think we should give it one more week. But in terms of panic meter, if you ask me, I'd say it's a 10 out of 10 concern for Miles Sanders. So I'd wait one more week. But if we see something similar next week, definitely just drop Miles Sanders. We don't want the backup running back who couldn't cut it as a starter, is now again the backup running back in an offense that is still just not particularly exciting for fantasy football.
No one who analyzes sports in any way, be it sports, betting, fantasy, the NFL in general, hits everything. But we got to celebrate some of our wins here. Josh was below consensus on Miles Sanders all off season, so pretty big hit for you there, pal. Colts here. The offense continues to be feisty. Their passing attack, in particular, just the job that Sean Steichen's done with 2 different quarterbacks this year. Like, if Coach of the Year was given to people doing the best job, I think the Colts would be right in the mix here. They're probably not going to be having enough success to get there, but honestly, I'm impressed with them every week. That said, Josh, tell us about Jonathan Taylor.
So Jonathan Taylor, this was his best game in terms of usage, where he outsnaps Zach Moss 41-26. He had more carries. He was more efficient with his carries, and he ran twice as many routes, 26-13. We talked about it last week, and I said, guys, last week, Jonathan Taylor, for the first time, he might be fully healthy. He's back. He was more efficient than Zach Moss on the ground and through the air 2 weeks ago. And then this past week, he was rewarded with a massive increase in snaps, massive increase in the routes run. I'm very optimistic about Taylor moving forward. He actually might be a nice little buy low because Zach Moss had more fantasy points. He happened to score the touchdown. But what's important is when we look at the goal line carries, it was 1-to-1 Taylor Moss. Moss more involved than I think we'd hope. But in terms of what the perception is, I think Taylor is actually trending more upward than people give him credit for. And then Ryan, before I kick it back to you, breaking news, everyone, breaking news. It was reported earlier this morning that Kyler Murray would not be playing in week 9. That has actually changed. Kyler Murray, the reports, he might actually play in week 9. Thank you, Jonathan Gannon, their head coach, for telling us he wouldn't play and now saying he may play. And if Kyler Murray doesn't play, it will not be Josh Dobbs. It will be Clayton Tune earning the start at quarterback. So I would say that is pretty disastrous. If Clayton Tune were to start, I thought Josh Dobbs had done enough. Ryan, does that shock you? Breaking news as of 10 minutes ago. Give me your instant reaction to the Kyler Murray saga.
You know me well. You clearly saw that I was a little blown away by that. I don't know what more could have been asked from Josh Downs in this situation, if I'm being honest. So that, if Kyler Murray comes back, that's bad for the Browns and survivor pools. But why would you pivot from Downs to? Yeah, I'm beside myself with that one, Josh.
All right, let's talk about another game. A more exciting.
Okay. We got a good one on deck here. There's a few good games on this slate. This is one of the key ones. Eagles versus Cowboys. Eagles are 3-point home favorites. Total's 46.5 points, which I talk about variable games. This means that odds makers view this as not quite an under, not quite an over. They're not sure which way this could go. That's because it could go either way, gentlemen. Eagles, this is what I'm going to take away from last week. Washington jumped out to a 14-3 lead. This happened to the Eagles last year against the Jaguars. Jaguars jumped out on top of them very early. But one of the things about the Eagles is they have enough horsepower to come back and win kind of convincingly. I know the score says that it was only a one-score game, but the Commanders scored late. So they came back and throttled Washington after that hot start from the Commanders. So Phil, it's been a long road to the top for Philly in my power rankings, but they will be there this week. They'll be the number one team. They're the last team with one loss. Have all the talent in the world in this group. That said, Josh, tell us about the Eagles offense.
Another thing that's number one, I will be making a switch in my rest of season rankings Wednesday. Jalen Hurts is going to usurp Josh Allen. I think he is the now new quarterback one rest of season. At least 21 fantasy points each of his last 7 games. At least 277 passing yards each of his past 6 games. At least 8 rush attempts in all but 1 game this year. You really just couldn't ask for more from a fantasy quarterback. It's time to anoint Hurts as the new king rest of season. A.J. Brown set the NFL record 6 straight games now with at least 125 receiving yards. He looks pretty uncoverable. Devonta Smith was productive in week 8. I know you and I both bet on him to go over his, whatever it was, like 49.5 receiving yards. He crushed it, caught all 7 targets for 99 yards and a touchdown. But negatively, those 7 targets were just a 20% target share. Dallas Goedert also had 7 targets in that game. Devonta Smith's depth of target was about half of A.J. Brown's in that game. So yes, it was a good game for Smith in fantasy. The regression hit, but I think some of our concerns with him are actually still there despite the good box score.
I like it. On the Dallas side, I expected Dallas to smash the Rams yesterday, and what I'll frame as a high pressure bet, Josh. I went with Dax over passing yards about an hour before kickoff. He hit it convincingly despite Dallas returning an interception for a touchdown. That's usually a death sentence for overs and passing yards because it steals a drive.
Mm-hmm.
But, Dallas's passing attack tore up the Rams last week, which, again, not a surprise. Dallas in general is one of the 5 most talented teams in the league. That said, Josh, you were below consensus on Tony Pollard entering the year. That continues to age well. What are you thinking with him rest of season? Plus, what are your thoughts on Dallas's surging passing attack?
Yeah, when the Cowboys have over 40 points in a game and Tony Pollard does nothing, that's concerning. Week 8 was just not what you want to see. And I think just in general, we've talked for a few weeks about how the efficiency's been bad. He's never been a guy with a big workload. He was a college wide receiver. He had never had 200 carries in a season going into this year. And they thrust him into a massive ultra bell cow workload. And I think it's wearing on him. This game, they scaled him back just 12 carries for 53 rushing yards. He only ran 19 routes. He was only targeted once. He caught the pass for 2 yards. This is just not what you want. He's been forcing missed tackles at 1/3 the rate he was last year. There's really very few good signs here for Pollard, where some people out there, they're like, well, he's still getting a lot of volume. And I'm like, yeah, but we know this is the position where injuries just hit every single year at running back. If you're telling me that a guy has never had a big workload and now he's got a big workload and he's not forcing missed tackles, he's taking so much more contact than before, and that's just going to make him a massive injury risk because there are a lot of other high usage players with sturdier frames taking less contact per game. Pass game, though, I mean, only good things to say there. It's trending up. I think CeeDee Lamb might be a top 8 fantasy receiver rest of season. So that's good news. The past 2 weeks, past 2 games, he's averaged over 10 targets, 9.5 catches, 138 yards per game, and he has scored each of those games. So when you're averaging 30 fantasy points a game over the past 2 weeks, and still one of those games, Michael Gallup was the target leader, which was inexplicable. I don't think that'll happen again. I'm very, very optimistic about CeeDee Lamb rest of season. And we might even call him a potential buy high in fantasy football.
I like it, Josh. Something that I'm not looking forward to this weekend is the Raiders versus the Giants. Raiders are 3-point home favorites. Game total is 38.5 points. We'll see the Raiders on Monday night against the Lions, but for the Giants, Josh, oh boy, the paper bags, it's on. If they lose to the Raiders, I'll do one of these shows next week with a paper bag on my head with a Giants logo. Defense continues to be good, but that offense was an affront to professional football. My God, Josh, I had trouble watching it. Is there any kind of positive you can glean from this situation?
Yeah, so the Giants were first, folks. I'll get to that in a second. So the team had 7 total passing yards on 14 pass attempts.
Impressive.
For context, I think all of us out there, the hardcore fans, we remember the Kendall Hinton game where the Broncos practice squad receiver was called up because he took a few college reps at quarterback back in the day. He had 9 passing yards in that game. That's more than 7. And the Giants are first. If you flip passing success rate, since the stats been tracked, which it's just a successful passing play is if you're gaining 50% or more of the yards needed on first or second down, and if you get a first down when you go for it on third and fourth down. Pass success rate, this was the worst performance since the stat has been tracked in the modern era. So congrats, Giants, for being top of the leaderboard somewhere. Tyrod Taylor might have broken ribs. Darren Waller suffered a hamstring injury. The one positive is that Saquon Barkley's usage was awesome. Carried the ball 36 times for 128 yards. He was targeted 5 times. Breida chipped in with only 5 carries. So 36 of those 41 running back carries went to Saquon. So yeah, good news for Saquon Barkley in fantasy. He can still produce even when the passing offense has the most horrific day over the past few decades. But yeah, offensive line, I think it's going to be overmatched by quite a bit, regardless of opponent. And I think we both agree that the Raiders' defensive line's been quite good this year.
Yeah, I mean, Max Crosby's a problem. Him alone, he is not a guy you want to deal with, especially when you have a bunch of injuries. And man, it's been tough for Giants fans this year, for sure. Sunday Night Football, another great game, one of the marquee games on the entire season. Bengals versus Bills. Bengals are 3-point home favorites. Game total is 48.5 points. On the Bengals side, they went into San Francisco off their bye and beat the 49ers kind of semi-convincingly, too. Their defense made some plays. More importantly, for all of us fantasy enthusiasts, offensive line had their best game of the year, in my opinion. Surprised at the run game success in particular, especially early. Pretty good holes for Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon looked pretty good, pretty fresh off the bye. Joe Burrow is definitely Joe Burrow again, which is wonderful for you dynasty guys. Well, maybe the more casual dynasty leagues, because the hardcore leagues, this guy's already not available at all. But Andre Iasovis, Josh, do I got that right? You're the pronunciation guy here.
I was going to say, I don't know how to say his name. Okay. I'm trying to remember what a buddy of mine's a big Bengals fan. He has a fun nickname. We'll look this up live because he said just call him by his nickname and then you won't have to worry. I still can't find his nickname, so you can keep going.
Anyway, just reliable looking player. I don't think he's going to blow the doors off anything, but as Cincinnati needs to shed salary over the next 2 years because they're going to have to pay. They already paid Burrow. They're going to have to pay Chase. I could see Iasovis being, Heather Boyd-ish long term. The Bengals look back, Josh. What happens from here with this offense?
So his nickname, folks, is Yoshi. That's found it. Okay. It's much easier to say, so we can just call him Yoshi. Few quick hitters. I think Joe Mixon looks like a top 12 running back rest of season in fantasy. I kept him kind of in that mix in my rest of season rankings. He's firmly in the top 12 once again. He'd always been getting pretty much all the touches. He had a top 3 role in fantasy when you look at just like percent of the running back room touches. His issue is that he's not a great talent anymore. Though, Ryan, quick one. Did he or did he not look a little bit more explosive in week 8 off the bye? Since I thought he showed a little bit of juice in this matchup.
Yeah, my answer would be yes. At least a little bit of juice, yeah.
Yeah, he had a couple runs, and I was like, you know what? There's at least some semblance of acceleration. Jamar Chase, a lot of people keep giving me crap week after week. They say you can't have Jamar Chase in your tier 1 of players. I had him as a slightly lesser Tyreek Hill type for fantasy, and people were really pissed. I still feel good about that. 21 fantasy points a game on the season. From week 3 onward, when the Bengals finally started to cook on offense, he's averaging 26 fantasy points a game. That's the same number Cooper Kupp had in 2021. Hill's having the historic season. He deserves to be ranked ahead, but Chase looks like an absolute tier 1 caliber player in fantasy football. This is why I was saying, please don't trade him away. Better days are ahead, and it's looking very, very good right now. T. Higgins, though, I think there should still be some concern. It was nice that his fantasy day was usable, but I don't know if he can be anything more than maybe a top 24 type option week to week. The target share was still under 20% in this matchup. He's just not been on the same page as Burrow, and all indications that he will not be extended and that he's basically on his way out of Cincinnati as well. So it would make sense if some of these younger players like Yoshi get a little bit more usage as the season goes along.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's injury related with Higgins or what the exact issue is, but he looks like he's a little bit, little less juice, lost a step. I don't want to say lost a step because I don't think it's permanent necessarily, but that's a little concerning for me too. On the Buffalo side of things, Josh Allen's on the short list of quarterbacks that could carry any offense. They're going to elevate anyone. Diggs is good, but he's blessed to play with this kind of quarterback. Same kind of thing when Greg Jennings with Aaron Rodgers. Stephon Diggs, I think he throws tantrums a little too often because it's like, listen, man, when I watch Bills games, and I watch all of them, I don't really see you blowing the doors off people very often like Tyreek Hill does. You're just a very good technician, very reliable, and that's great. But Gabe Davis has been a factor regularly this year. Kincaid's a factor now. More versatile offense. James Cook is fast. We talked about this last year, Josh. I thought the Bills' supporting cast on offense was a little more average than people realize. This year, I don't think that's the case. What do you think about this group?
Yeah, I think we should mention that today Leonard Fournette just signed with the Bills. So while there was some good momentum with James Cook, I think we should be a little cautious. The thing with Fournette is a lot of the fantasy community doesn't like him. Ultimately, he's capable everywhere. Good pass blocker. He can catch passes. He doesn't fumble much, so he can get the goal line work. It's the type of player that Tom Brady loved. And I think Tom Brady's a pretty good evaluator of talent. He's Tom Brady. So if he wanted to play the twilight of his career with Leonard Fournette as a near every down back, I think there's still something left in the tank here. So I'd be a little concerned with James Cook. In fantasy, I think Latavius Murray is potentially getting absolutely nuked with this move. Ryan, you've been a big Dalton Kincaid guy. You talked about how him being on this team was one of the main reasons that you were optimistic about the supporting cast, that it's not just Diggs and Davis in the pass game. There's Kincaid. It was pretty good news. 7 targets without Dawson Knox. Caught 5 for 65 yards and a touchdown. He actually didn't have some elite target share or anything like that in this game, but still, it's the Bills offense and a talented player. And if you're getting nearly 20 fantasy points when he was the clear number 3 in the pass game, I think we have to feel pretty good about that. I think he's kind of a top 8 fantasy tight end rest of season. I think I'd want him over McBride slightly, but I think we could have the same conversation like we just did with McBride, where you look at Evan Engram and you're like, you know what? I don't think Evan Engram looks all that much better rest of season than Kincaid and McBride.
I agree. Tough call, but I agree. I have Kincaid in a number of my teams, and I'm thrilled with what's going on. Last game, Josh, Monday Night Football, the Jets versus the Chargers. Jets are 3-point home underdogs, 41.5 game total. Josh, let me frame it this way. Sam Howell's better than Zach Wilson. All of the positive things about Zach Wilson, again, I watched all the snaps. Last week's game, the win will help a little bit, but he was absolutely horrendous against the Giants last week in a very winnable game. They won by the skin of their teeth, kind of like in a miracle fashion. This is a championship caliber team without Aaron Rodgers, like we said going into the year, but with Zach Wilson, are Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson the only fantasy options on this team because of Zach Wilson?
Yeah, I'd say so. Breece Hall, still a mid-range fantasy RB1 rest of season. Garrett Wilson looks like a mid to low-end fantasy wide receiver 2 rest of season. I think if you're playing fantasy and you don't know the names of any other Jets player on the team, you will be just fine for the remainder of your year.
For the Chargers, Josh, your beloved Chargers, got it back on track against the Bears on Sunday night. Herbert's a stud. We all know that. My thing with him that I absolutely love is when he's contacted, when he's in the grasp, the only guy I can think of in recent memory that's even close to being a playmaker in those situations is Big Ben. He's just such a strong guy. He makes plays that no one else can make. a regular basis. We were all over Austin Eckler's over receiving yards last Sunday. That happened in the first quarter on one play. We went over there. Quentin Johnston, to me, he saw more usage than he has in previous games. He looks a bit like Jahan Dotson to me, which means just a guy that got taken in the first round. I don't see anything that makes me excited. What do you think about the Chargers offense and Johnston in particular?
Yeah, that was a very encouraging day for Austin Eckler out there. I know that you, Ben Wolby, myself, we talked about him on the Player Prop Happy Hour. You and I talked about him on our fantasy show on Monday, on Thursday. All we said was, whenever these come out, we will be smashing the over there. It was really just the absolute perfect scenario for him. Less positively, I think we shouldn't get too excited about Quentin Johnston. A lot of people out there, they think it's time to get so excited. And I would say I'm encouraged, but I'm not excited. He had 6 targets. That was a 16% target share. Keenan Allen and Austin Eckler had more targets than him. His average depth of target positively was under 8 yards. I guess for him, actually, that's weirdly good. It seemed like he was mostly just running go routes prior to this week. But then we zoom out a little more context. Josh Palmer wasn't 100% coming into this game, and then he got re-injured mid-game. He didn't miss too many snaps, but it was clear that Palmer wasn't healthy. And if you're telling me that Quentin Johnston going 5 for 50 is the massive breakout with a 16% target share, I would disagree. So still think he's a good bench stash. I certainly would not start him against the Jets in week 9. And folks, I would certainly tune in though when Ryan and I are back on the airwaves on Thursday. We'll be debuting a slightly new format for that show. And one of the big things we'll be discussing is for all the teams out there that after 8 weeks are 4-4, 5-3, 6-2, 7-1, maybe even 8-0, you should be preparing for the fantasy playoffs. You might say, well, 4-4. Yes. Ultimately, we want to win. We want to get first place. If it seems like you're even sniffing the playoffs at this point, you should begin to optimize your roster where if you get into the playoffs, then you have the guys in the right matchups. We will walk you through a lot of info there on Thursday, and I think you'll find that show very, very helpful. Ryan Reynolds is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. All his work is on the33rdteam.com. Power rankings drop tomorrow. His expert picks and predictions for every game drop Thursday. From Ryan Reynolds, from myself, Josh Larky, from the 33rd team, Taylor Swift. Thank you, everyone.